Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host, cosmic horror author and storytelling enthusiast Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by Larry Holsworth. So be sure to show him some love in the comments as you deploy your likes, complain about who Jefferson was as a person, subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves learning about presidents. Let's get to it. So let's get this out of the way right off the bat. Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. Born into a system built upon slavery, lived within an economy dependent upon it, and though he wrote numerous impassioned condemnations of that system, continued to practice it, uncertain as to how it could be ended without disaster. He even predicted how that disaster would unfold, which is a story for another day, and something we'd rather not get too into in the intro to a video about how Jefferson improved the book stand. We're getting there, we promise. As for the other thing everyone knows about Jefferson, that he took slaves as his concubines and, yes, fathered children with them, despite the laws in Virginia prescribing such acts, this remains the subject of fierce debate. DNA testing in the late 20th century, as well as the records of the area, frustratingly do not offer a concrete answer on whether or not Jefferson did the nasty with women he legally owned. The debate is understandably an impassioned one, fueled by the prejudices and opinions of an era far removed from the one in which the participants lived. Yet, despite Jefferson's faults, perceived, real, or imagined, there is no dispute that few individuals had a greater impact on American history, many in ways well known and others in ways largely forgotten, which is what this video is largely going to be about. But we couldn't not mention Jefferson's modern reputation before getting to that. I mean, it would be really weird if we didn't, right? Anyway, throughout his long life, Thomas Jefferson was an innovator. When he saw something that could be improved upon, he took steps to do so, often after long and careful study. He took the classic architecture of history, altered it slightly to his own tastes, and created many of the modern designs now paradoxically referred to as classical themselves, including the US Capitol, the White House, the capital of Virginia in Richmond, go Richmond, and his own homes in Monticello and less well-known Poplar Forest. The latter was one of the first octagonal houses ever built in North America. Why octagonal? Well, according to the Center for the Study of Diagonality, which we swear we didn't make up, it's because an octagonal house would have windows that faced in 8 directions, improving ventilation. Which begs the question, if that was the reason for building an 8-sided house, why stop at 8? Why not 10, 12? We guess that is also a mystery for another day. Moving on, Jefferson's innovations were both large and small, public and private, yet all continue to influence modern life, and due to Jefferson's, shall we say, other activities, they tend to be overlooked in discussions of the man. So let's remedy that and discuss some of the less well-known ways in which Thomas Jefferson made a lasting impact during his own time and in posterity. Thomas Jefferson's personal life, whether at his farms or in one of the many political offices he held over his long career, was largely spent in the review or preparation of correspondence. Even in his retirement in Monticello, he spent a minimum of 5 hours every day laboring over his papers, letters, diaries, logbooks, account books, and other forms of what must have seemed an unending stream of paperwork. His labors were increased by the need to retain copies of his work, in part due to the unreliable mail service of the time, and in part to either refute or confirm the reports of others regarding his statements and avowed positions on issues. This may surprise some people, but Thomas Jefferson wasn't exactly an easy man to get along with, and frequently got into arguments. So he needed them receipts. To this end, and throughout his career, Jefferson employed secretaries whose duties chiefly consisted of assisting him with such mundane details. One of these was Meriwether Lewis, whose long service Jefferson rewarded with the command of the Corps of Discovery in 1804. That mission became known to history as the Lewis and Clark Expedition. The majority of his secretaries gained no such fame, however, laboring unknown until forgotten by time. In 1783, Jefferson was in Paris, sent there by the Confederation Congress to serve as minister to France, replacing Benjamin Franklin. Jefferson paid his respects to Dr. Franklin upon his arrival, and there saw a machine which the doctor used routinely to make copies of his personal documents and letters, saved in his own hand. The copies were made on a machine which resembled a printing press recently invented in London. Franklin had been a printer in England years before the, let's say, unpleasantness between Britain and America, and had maintained many of his contacts there, which gained him access to the newly invented machine. Its use required both special ink and paper, both of which had to be purchased at considerable expense from its inventor. So in a way, it was fairly similar to a modern home printer in that the real cost wasn't the machine itself, but the ink. Jefferson was intrigued with the device, writing to Madison and others in America of its value in producing true copies, yet he was not ready to accept it fully. Simply put, it was too large for practical use in a private office. The machine required the user to produce a document to be copied using the special ink, which was thicker than normal and dried more slowly on paper which was far thinner than that generally used at the time. The document was then placed in the machine, a second page placed on top, and the two squeezed together by the mechanical press. The action produced a mirror image of the original, which was then deciphered by reading the reverse. Though it produced a true copy, the image was blurred by the spreading of the ink under pressure. For someone with small handwriting like Jefferson, the result was often indecipherable for all but the originator. Still, Jefferson was enamored with the device. In 1786, Jefferson visited John Adams in London and took the time to view one such copying machine. He obtained the dimensions of the device and tasked a London workman with building a smaller version, paying the man the princely sum of £5 which admittedly would have been the equivalent of £1,000 today due to inflation. Upon his return to Paris, Jefferson then had a technician who worked at the Louvre make a bunch of copies for his friends. The resulting device was considerably smaller, making it easier to move with its owner when relocating his office. Jefferson had, albeit inadvertently, created one of the first portable office copiers. It would later emerge a cabinet maker in London had created a similar device earlier than Jefferson, but it seems neither man was aware of the work of the other. You know, a case of simultaneous invention. While the copier served Jefferson and his office well for many years, by the 19th century Jefferson had taken to using a much more sophisticated machine, at least by the standards of the time. A polygraph. Now, when we say polygraph, most people probably picture one of those lie detector things, which, fun fact, don't work as lie detectors, have never worked as lie detectors, to the point the Supreme Court has ruled that the results they get are inadmissible as evidence, but alas, that is also a story for another day. And the device Jefferson used operated on a similar principle. Mainly the little stick thing that scratches up and down. Specifically, the polygraph used by Jefferson was a machine devised to produce two copies of the same document as it was being written. Two pens were connected via a system of rods and pulleys, allowing the pen manipulated by the machine to follow exactly the pen used by the composer. It produced in the writer's hand an exact copy of what was written. Invented by an Englishman who had moved to Philadelphia named John Hawkins, Jefferson saw the machine demonstrated there and was so impressed he called the device the finest invention of the present age. Jefferson's view was shaped in large part because the true copy could be created without additional labor by the author, and without needing to rely on the labors and discretion of his secretary, an indication that as his political career advanced, so had his desire for complete secrecy in some areas. He had polygraphs installed in the White House and in his home at Monticello. By 1809, when he retired from office, Jefferson wrote to a friend that he had discarded use of the copying machine in favor of the polygraph. "The polygraph has spoiled me for the old copying press, the copies of which are hardly ever legible." Jefferson continued using the polygraph for the rest of his life, making frequent references to it in correspondence and keeping machines at his home at Monticello and Poplar Forest. Jefferson's experience with the copy machine and subsequent adoption of the polygraph offers an interesting insight into his character. He was quick to adopt new technology when he found it likely to improve what was, to him, modern life. He was equally quick to replace it when what he perceived as new, improved technology emerged. Machines to reproduce his correspondence were not the only area of concern for Thomas Jefferson when equipping the modern office. A true polymath, Jefferson maintained lifelong interests in an amazingly diverse number of subjects, including their history, their present, and their potential future. His desk was often cluttered with books from which he derived arcane information. which makes him just sound like a wizard. For example, he studied the Bible to derive information regarding farming by the ancients. Books scattered across a desk or tabletop were difficult to keep sorted, with immediate reference to the salient points he wished to review. A modern point of comparison would be having just way too many tabs open at once. I think Karl is calling me out here because he has seen my desktop, which, as anyone who engages in the practice of open tab warfare knows, can be fairly overwhelming sometimes, to say the least. To ease his ability to make reference to books and documents, Jefferson devised a revolving bookstand which allowed him to quickly reference and read from multiple books at once, whilst only taking up a comparatively small amount of space on his desk. As for how he came up with the idea, Jefferson was a virtuoso violinist and enjoyed playing with other musicians. His bookstand likely was inspired by the music stands where the musicians kept their scores as they played. Jefferson's bookstand, which he kept at the White House while in office and at Monticello in retirement, contained 5 separate racks to hold open volumes with pins to keep them open to the desired page. The bookstand offered the ability to rapidly refer to each volume, rotating it in either direction as necessary, rather than flipping through the volumes on the otherwise cluttered desk. Jefferson could thus quickly refer to his New Testament in Greek, Latin, and English, all languages with which he was intimately familiar, as he attempted a more accurate interpretation of the Bible in the 1820s. It is likely that more than one revolving bookstand was resorted to in his Monticello study, with another holding farm records, yet another books of classic antiquity, Homer and Plato, for example, alongside works of John Locke and Voltaire. The man was a true polymath. Another piece of office furniture that Jefferson favored and developed was one created in part due to the need to light one's workspace with candle or oil lamp. He also found it inconvenient to continually reorient his chair when meeting with numerous people at once. His solution was what is today considered so normal as to be scarcely given a thought. Jefferson equipped his offices and private studies with one of the earliest examples of the swivel chair. And the editor says, "You may rotate if you wish." And you know what, Karl? I think I will. Whee! I can turn here. I can turn here. There are many signs that claim Thomas Jefferson invented the swivel chair, which he called a revolving Windsor chair. Though that seems unlikely, he undoubtedly improved upon the original design as records at Monticello's show. Jefferson likely encountered the swivel chair in Philadelphia in 1776, and when he returned to his home, he brought it with him. Over the subsequent years, it was modified several times in Monticello's own carpentry shops, including the addition of a writing pad mounted on the right arm, which, if used today, would almost certainly have a laptop on it playing a podcast. Or, something that rhymes with corn. Whether he invented the swivel chair, having it built for him by a Philadelphia furniture maker, as some claim, is immaterial. There is no doubt that he was one of the earliest users of such a piece of furniture, and that he adapted the design to suit his own purposes over the years is entirely within his character. The polygraph copying machine, swivel chair, and book rack are all available for inspection at Monticello today, samples of his fascination with even the simplest of technologies. Thomas Jefferson was a firm believer in education, most of all through the continuing education through experience and observation. Though he was schooled in the classics and mathematics and read in the law, he was first and foremost an agriculturist. At his Virginia farms, he was constantly experimenting with new crops, introducing new plants to Virginia from Europe, Africa, and the islands around the world. So I wonder if he's responsible for the introduction of English ivy to Virginia, because that stuff will not go away. He experimented with vineyards, nuts from Spain and North Africa, citrus fruits, olives, and new types of pest-resistant grains. During his sojourns in Europe, he observed evolving methods of farming in France and Italy. Among his observations recorded in the 1780s and 1790s in France and Spain were what he perceived as the failings of the plows then commonly in use. Jefferson found the plows to be inefficient in the manner in which they turned over the soil, as they were forced through the ground by animal power, leaving behind irregular furrows with lengths so poorly turned they were unable to receive seed. He attributed their shortcomings to a poorly designed mold board. As a plow is driven through the soil, a cutting blade and divider, called a coulter, split the soil. The mold board then thrust the soil upwards and over, creating a furrow of churned soil. In 1788, Jefferson recorded in his notes his perceived deficiencies in the design, then in vogue, and his suggestions for correcting them. Jefferson began experimenting with a new mold board of his own design at Monticello in the 1790s, and by mid-decade boasted of its success to Scottish statistician, agriculturist, and fellow polymath Sir John Sinclair. In 1810, after Jefferson retired from the White House, Monticello's armory began manufacturing the mold board from iron, as previously it had been made from wood. Jefferson was pleased with the simplicity of his design, which made it possible for even unskilled artisans to reproduce it with relative ease, and made the design available to anyone who asked. It was probably Jefferson's one true invention, though he chose not to pursue a patent on the device. Like George Washington, who had invented a new form of seed drill for use in planting but refused to patent it, Jefferson believed that innovations in agriculture belonged to all who sought to pursue the difficult profession of farming. Jefferson's extensive gardens at his home at Monticello and Poplar Forest played an important role in providing fruits, vegetables, and herbs for consumption, yet they also served as experimental laboratories. Jefferson flower gardens grew ornamental plants for decoration, but also plants used to develop medicines, to control pests organically, and to develop hardier species resistant to disease and pestilence. Most contemporaneous gardens grew native species, content to harvest food for the table and flowers for decoration. Jefferson pushed the envelope to expand what could and couldn't be cultivated in America. His fruit gardens contained over 300 species, some native to Virginia, some imported from Asia, the Pacific Islands, Africa, Europe, and Central and South America. His gardens were designed to take advantage of the orientation of their grounds in relation to rainfall, drainage, and wind direction, as well as periods of sunlight and shade most beneficial to the plants. The gardens at the main house at Monticello were not the only producers of fruit and vegetables for table. Jefferson's slave quarters had extensive gardens of their own, which were used entirely for the purpose of growing food rather than for experimentation. Records at Monticello included those of Jefferson purchasing fruits and vegetables from his enslaved people, paying for them in cash or credit. Produce purchased by Jefferson, his wife Martha, and his daughters included potatoes and sweet potatoes, cabbages, beans, tomatoes, and fruits including melons, berries, and others. Both chickens and eggs were purchased from enslaved people on the estate, particularly when large numbers of guests were visiting. Monticello's enslaved peoples were also able to sell their own produce at markets in Charlottesville, as well as other plantations. In this activity, Jefferson was again an innovator, as he paid his enslaved peoples for both goods and services, despite the frequent protests from neighbors and planters from other states. Jefferson also hired out enslaved laborers to other farms and work projects, including during the construction of the Capitol, State, and War Building and White House, as well as workers who contributed to the construction of the University of Virginia. He allowed them to keep their wages and use them to purchase, among other things, their own freedom or that of family members, which is, well, sort of refreshing to hear, as sentences involving Jefferson and slaves don't often end on a good note. Anyway. Both Jefferson's predecessors in the presidency, George Washington and John Adams, believed the powers of the office were limited to those specified by the Constitution. Jefferson served in Washington's administration as Secretary of State and largely agreed with that sentiment. As his immediate predecessor's administration unfolded, Jefferson grew to support that view even more strongly, supporting the idea of limiting the power of the presidency and the federal government in favor of the states' governments. Jefferson grew to believe the more populated northeastern states would develop a tyrannical relationship with the less populated agrarian economies of the South. In essence, Thomas Jefferson entered the White House with the belief that if the Constitution said the president could do it, he could do it. If the Constitution did not specify that the president could do it, he could not do it. That not specified in the Constitution as belonging to the federal government belonged to the states or the people. Period. Jefferson wanted to reduce the power of the federal government reduce the national debt, and keep the United States out of Europe's ongoing wars, which threatened the West Indies and American trade. Then came an unexpected development. Jefferson had dispatched envoys to negotiate a purchase of New Orleans, or failing that, the right to unimpeded trade along the Mississippi River. When his envoys replied from France, it was with the news that the French ruler Napoleon had offered to sell all of the vast Louisiana territory, doubling the size of the United States, for roughly 15 cents per acre. It was, at the time, the largest purchase of land in history. In fact, most of the land wasn't controlled by France. It was occupied and disputed over by various Native American tribes. The French controlled New Orleans and some of the lands and waterways nearby, though that control was disputed as well. France and Spain were diplomatically at odds over the port of New Orleans. Jefferson's envoys had accepted on behalf of the President of the United States, yet even Jefferson doubted that his office under the Constitution had the authority to enter into such a transaction. Yet he pushed the Senate to ratify the purchase, in the guise of a treaty, which it was his authority to enter into with the advice and consent of the Senate. Fortunately for American history and the concept of manifest destiny, I guess, the majority of the senators knew a great deal when they saw one. The vote to ratify the purchase in the Senate was 24-7. Even with a senatorial endorsement, Jefferson questioned the constitutionality of his own actions and qualified his own acceptance as being willing to acquiesce rather than to celebrate his victory. He continued to claim that his views of the Constitution's limits on the power of the presidency had not changed. Yet his purchase of the Louisiana Territory forever changed the power of the office, giving it powers of leadership which expanded far beyond what had been its previously defined role of presiding over the execution of laws enacted by Congress. Quite simply, Jefferson needed to expand the powers of the presidency to expand the nation. He did what the situation required. It was an innovation which continues to affect the image and power of the presidency to the present day. Thomas Jefferson was schooled largely by representatives of various religious factions in the British colony of Virginia. His earliest formal education, which consisted of studying Latin, Greek, French, and various philosophies in those languages, was under the supervision of Scottish Presbyterians. He entered the College of William and Mary in 1761, then 18 years old, and continued in such studies, as well as in mathematics and the philosophy of various thinkers of the Enlightenment. Yet William and Mary was an Anglican school, with faculty and students required to maintain their standing in the church, accede to its laws, and tithe in accordance with its precepts. After completing his schooling in 1762, Jefferson entered the law office of George Wythe in Williamsburg, Virginia, where he read the law preparatory to entering the bar. By then, he had already developed what were lifelong passions for him in the fields of law, mathematics, architecture, agriculture, philosophy, natural law, ethics, and the sciences. He had already acquired the first of what over his lifetime became several extensive libraries, and he had already acquired the opinion that organized religion was diametrically opposed to freedom of thought in all areas. To Jefferson, a natural religion trumped organized religious dogma. Truly the Redditor's president. In the early 19th century, after a life spent serving in positions which included Minister to France, Governor of Virginia, Secretary of State, Vice President of the United States, President of the United States, and as the principal author of the Declaration of Independence and the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, Jefferson decided to recreate public education in America. He envisioned an institution entirely devoid of religious affiliation or influence. It was also to be devoid of governmental influence or control. It was to be governed by the students, guided by the faculty. He designed his new school, which he called an academical village, with such goals in mind. Jefferson laid out his school on a broad lawn down the mountain from his Monticello estate. He designed the grounds, the buildings, the walkways, gardens, and support buildings for his village. At the center of his village, he placed the library, housed in a rotunda of his own design, based upon the Roman Pantheon, which he had personally inspected decades earlier. This was at a time when most institutions of higher learning were centered upon a church. Jefferson placed a secular library at the center of his academical village, establishing the concept of knowledge over dogma. He placed 10 pavilions in a quadrangle around the lawn, connected to the rotunda via colonnades, beyond which were located rooms for students. Students and faculty lived on the grounds, governed themselves as to their behavior. Gardens behind the students' quarters helped provide food for the school. Admission was to be based on ability and character, not social status and prestige. Jefferson designed the curricula as well as the facilities in consultation with his fellow Virginians and former presidents James Madison and James Monroe, as well as others. What they created was the University of Virginia. At the time, the College of William and Mary was still the most influential institution of higher learning in Virginia. It required the students to learn and recite the Catechism of the Anglican Church, regardless of what academic disciplines they were studying. Jefferson's courses of study held no such requirement. Though students could study at 8 different schools, religion or divinity were not one of them. It was Jefferson's expressed opinion that theology should have no place in the education of students at his academic village. To this day, there has never been a professor of theology at the University of Virginia. The school opened in 1825, yet students were not prescribed from worshiping as they deemed fit, if they deemed fit, at churches in Charlottesville, at chapels on nearby plantations, and in other settlements and villages. The separation of church and state and the role of religion in public education was as controversial then as it is today. And Jefferson's views were seen as innovative by others and heretical by others. Jefferson reinforced his views during the remaining years of his life by hosting students and faculty members at dinners at Monticello, where discussions of university life and administration enlivened the gatherings. Following Jefferson's death in 1826, James Madison succeeded him as rector and continued the tradition at his nearby home, Montpelier. The academic village, which housed the original university, remains in place, with students still occupying most of the original rooms, a mark of distinction among underclassmen. The rotunda still serves as the center of the university. There are still 8 undergraduate schools, supplemented over time by 3 professional schools for those studying for advanced degrees. With this in mind, the University of Virginia is likely the most influential innovation out of the life of Thomas Jefferson, as it will likely continue to help mold minds that will innovate and influence for as long as it continues to stand. Well, I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment down below, subscribe, check out my Story Rant channel, and share this video with someone who loves learning about history. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.